Hey guys, today we're going to be looking at the set matrix zeros problem. We're given an m by n integer matrix, and if an element is 0, we set its entire row and column to zeros and return the matrix, and we have to do this in place. So here, just looking at the example, you see this middle element is a 0. Do we want to set every element in the same row as that 0 to a 0? And every element in the same column as that 0 to a 0. So this is how it should look in the end on this right hand side here. So how do we want to do this? Well, my naive solution was basically we have a matrix, and I'll just use the example. And these are the indices. So this will be, that'll be I, and these indices will be J. So we're just gonna loop through every row and every element in each row. And we're gonna check if it's 0. And if it is, then we want to set the entire row and the entire column to be 0. So how do we do that? Basically, I made two variables, one called rows and one called calls. And basically these are just sets that will keep track of which row indices I should set to 0 and which column indices I should set to 0. And we're going to start at the element 0, 0 of the array, and we're going to check if that element is a 0. And if it's not, we're just going to continue to the next element, and so on and so forth until we hit an element that is a 0. Now, if it is a 0, then we take the current column that this element is in, which is 1, and we add it to our column set. And we do the same for our rows. So it's in column 1, row 1. We add 1 to our rows, our set of rows, and 1 to our set of columns. And then we continue along as we have done previously. And it doesn't look like any more elements are zeros. So at the end, we have these two sets. Which rows should I set to 0 and which column should I set to 0? So we will literally just we'll just go through the array again, and we'll just check, like, is this element in a row that is in this set, or is it in a column that is in this set? And if it is, then we'll set it to be 0. So that's exactly what this solution here does. Now you guys can tell me if you want, if it would be more helpful to type it out live, or if it would just be more helpful to explain the code. For this video, I'm just going to explain the code. So here's the two sets I'm talking about that correspond to these. And oops. Why can't I show line numbers just to make it easier? So I've made my two sets. Then these are just convenience variables. So it's an m by n matrix. So m is the number of rows, n is the number of columns. So for every index in M, which is the number of rows, and every index in the range of a given row, which is the number of columns, check if that element is 0. And if it is, then, like I said, I add the row index of this element to our row set and the column index of this element to our column set. and we're done. And then what I do is I said I was going to iterate the matrix again, but actually instead I'm just going to go through every element in this set and just set that whole row to be zeros. So here, for row in rows, and then for every element in that row, I set that element to be 0. Same thing for the columns. For every column in there, in this set, I go through every row, and then I set the column in each row at this index to be 0. And then I return my matrix. And that's it. I can copy this solution over into LeetCode. And I'll just submit it. And there we have it. That's our naive solution. Okay, so we did our naive solution, but is there a more advanced solution? Yes. It's a lot more thinking involved, more complicated, more code. It does save you on memory. So if you absolutely need to save on memory, then this would be the solution to go with. So basically we need a way to determine which rows and which columns we're going to be setting to 0, right? And in our naive solution, I made a set of rows to store the rows that would be all zeros, and a set of columns to store the set of column indices that would all be set to 0. But what if I didn't want to do that? What if I don't want to use these sets because I don't have the space for them for whatever reason? Maybe our matrix is huge. So what can we do? Can we use the matrix itself to determine whether or not a row should be set to 0 or a column should be set to 0? Well, let's draw our little matrix out again, and we'll write in the indices. If I wanted to indicate that every value in a given row should be 0, it would make sense to maybe use the values in the first column to do that. Okay, we're looking at this element. Let's say we've gone through our array and now we're at this element. Okay, how do I say I want this row to be all zeros? Well, I could use the first element of this row to indicate that all elements in this row are 0. So if I set that to be 0, then the next time I iterate this array, I'll know, okay, every element in row 1 should be a 0. And same goes for the column here. I'll change that to be a 0 as well. So we're essentially using the first row and the first column as a flag column. They're now telling us whether or not each row or each column should be all zeros. So what's the problem with that? Well, the problem is that, now that I've changed these values to be 0 in blue, I've modified what our original matrix used to look like, which was this, right? So we've changed this to 0, this element here, to a 0, which would mean the next time I go through this matrix, I'll see that 0 and I'll think, oh, okay, well, this whole row is 0. No. Instead, we basically want to keep track of if the first row and the first column had a 0 in them to begin with. So our first step in our algorithm will be, okay, let's look at all of these elements. Okay. Any zeros? No. Okay, so let's make a variable. So first row has 0. We'll set that to be false. Same thing for the column. So next thing we do is we'll go through all of these elements and we'll ask ourselves, any zeros? No, except this variable will be first call has 0 equals false. And if we see a 0, then we'll just set this to be true. So there we go. Now we have two variables that will tell us if the first row or the first column had any zeros in them. So we can now freely modify the first row and the first column to use as flags. So now what? Well, now we want to go through the rest of the matrix and figure out where the zeros are. And then we want to set the flags in our matrix. So we're actually the next step will be starting here, because we've already gone through the first row and the first column. So we will only be looking at these values in our matrix. So we'll start here at this element 1, 1, and we'll check if it's a 0. If it is, then we'll set our row and column flags to indicate this row. The element we have here is in row 1, column 1. So all elements in column 1 should be 0. We'll change that to 0. And all elements in row 1 should be 0. So we'll change that to be 0. And that's it. Then we'll go to the next value and we'll check if it's 0. It's not. So we'll continue. Not 0. We'll continue. And then we're done. So at the end of all of this, we'll have something like this. Now what? Now what do we do? Well, so now we'll use the flags that we set to go through our inner matrix here and set values to 0 or not. So here we're looking at 0. We check the first element of this row. Is it 0? Yes, it is. We also want to check if the first element in this column is 0. So either of those things would tell us that we need to set this guy to 0. Then we set this to be 0. It is already 0, but we do it anyways. And then we go to the next number. And we do the same thing. And here we see that the first element in this row is 0, but the first element in this column is not. But since the first condition satisfies, then we set it to be 0. We move on here, and as you can see, there's a 0 in this column, so we'll set that to be 0. And then finally we get to this 1. So what happens? What's the result of all of this? Well, we got 1, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 1. And that's actually the right answer. If you look at the example here, that is the correct answer. But we're missing something here because we set these variables up here. First row has 0, first call has 0. Why did we do that? We did that because we modified our first row and our first column. So we want to know if they had zeros to begin with. And if they did, then we want to set the first row and the first column to be 0. So here, if first row has set row 0 to zeros, and if first call has 0, set call 0 to zeros. And that's it. So I'll show you the code here, and we'll just go over it really quickly. So again, step by step. We're setting these two Boolean flags because we know we're going to modify our first row and our first column. So we're setting them to be false initially. And then we set our convenience variables. So m is the number of rows and n is the number of columns. We go through every element in the first row and we check to see if there's any zeros. So for j in range n, which is the number of elements in a row, if any element in that row has a 0, we change the first row as 0 to true and we break. So again, we're just checking all of the elements in this first row. And then we do the same. We check all of the elements in the first column. If any of them have 0, we set first column as 0 to be true, and then we break. So that should have taken care of the first step. Now, what was our second step? Well, you can actually see from my comments here, and this will make your life much easier by commenting your own code. you'll immediately be able to see, okay, this section is checking the first column for zeros. This section is checking first row for zeros. This chunk of code is checking the inner matrix for zeros and setting zero flags in first row and col. So that's this part here. We're looking at all of these values in the inner matrix, and if they're zero, then I set the first element of the current row to be zero. So I set this guy to be zero, and then the first element of the current column to be zero, which is this guy. So that's what these two lines do. Okay, so we've set our flags now in our first row and our first column. Now what? Now we want to apply those flags. So again, we go through our inner matrix here, and at each point, we're checking if the first element in this row is zero, or the first element in this column is zero. And if so, we set this value to be zero. So here, if the first element in the current row is zero, or the first element in the current column is zero, then we set this value to be zero. And then finally at the bottom here, we're checking our first row has zero and first col has zero, and if so, we set the whole first row to be zero, and then we set the whole first column to be zero. And that's our solution. So we can just copy that in, submit it, and that's it. We're done. That's the advanced solution.